Dr. Genevieve Carter regarding her experiences at Manzanar. Today is the 23rd of February, 1987.
Isn't today the 24th? Because I had my birthday yesterday.
Is this the 24th? And your birthday was yesterday.
And the party was last night.
That's right. It was quite a party, wasn't it? Dr. Carter, this is a long time ago experience for you, but I wonder if you could briefly tell in general what the Manzanar program was.
The Manzanar program was, let's put it this way, Manzanar was just one among 10 centers that provided a relocation of the American Japanese from the West Coast following the Pearl Harbor attack. Is there anything more you want about it? There's one thing that's often confused, and that is the detention camps that were opened up earlier, that where the FBI and other security agencies had made an early arrest of males, Japanese males, all over Issei, I think. Could have been a few Kibe in there. But they were so-called picked up early and detained, which that's a different movement and a different kind of situation. That was a thoroughly a wartime move. However, the evacuation of the West Coast included the families, and the movement of something like 100,000 or more American Japanese from the West Coast. Also, it meant that those in the Middle West and East were not asked to move.
I see. And what year was that the families were moved? You remember?
41, I think.
1941, yes. I know that you've made other tapes on your experience at Manzanar, and I wondered, just for the record, you could tell me where these might be kept at the present time.
Yes, the first tapes I made were for the purpose of a gift for the Manzanar Museum located at Independence, because some friends of mine among the American Japanese wanted to have this added because they had very little that had been given to them of record from the Caucasian staff. They had there have been several books, as you know, written by some of the residents of Manzanar, but nothing has been published that was written by the staff. There was a second copy of the tapes made for the University of New Mexico History Department. As a result of one of the Smithsonian Institute visitors of their staff, another copy was made. As far as I know, it went back with him to the Smithsonian Institute.
Mm-hmm. So these will be kept for posterity, and might be available to anyone who has an interest in this.
Also, the big depository of material is the University of California.
At Berkeley?
No, I think at Los Angeles.
At UCLA.
Because, you see, the large population from the Los Angeles area was the one I think affected California the most.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason why I think it was centered there. However, Fullerton must have received a good-sized grant, because they're engaged in quite a bit of research now with this depository of material on Manzanar and also on the other camps too.
That's Fullerton College?
Yes.
Yes, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Could you tell me how you became involved in the program?
I was just finishing up my doctor's degree in Berkeley, and I had been working at the Institute of Child Welfare, the Child Welfare Center in Berkeley, University of California, Dr. Harold and Dr. Mary Jones as director and assistant director. My job there was interesting in that they employed me as a person, as Dr. Jones said, who could get behind the counters. And I did all the juvenile police, the courts, and the families, and the agencies, and the schools, and all of the for the adolescent study. So I was a community person.
I see.
which is a little different from being a theoretician or the mathematician and some of the other members of the staff that the adolescents studied. So that whenever Dorothy Thomas, and to explain who she is, those of us who remember her husband I.W. Thomas and the Polish peasant had by this time married Dorothy Thomas, and she was one of the well-known sociologists, I would say, in demography. The federal government had employed her to document the movement of the Japanese to the temporary receiving shelters or the racetrack places, as we've often heard about them, and to see one or two of the groups who went to more permanent residence for the relocation camps. And Manzanar was one of them, because Manzanar was both a receiving center and a permanent center. So I traveled with her as the young, I suppose, assistant to the stables up and down the coast. And it was pretty rough, if we do say so. It was the accommodations were army cots, and the environment wasn't too fragrant, and the people were upset. They had to leave in such a hurry. There was distress, but I think the greatest concern was keeping the family together, whatever, to keep the family, and keep counting them all the time to make sure they had the family, and the family could be anywhere from 5 or 6 to about 23, 25, and they were from around the area in Los Angeles. A little later, I happened to go to Manzanar. By that time, Dr. Thomas was beginning to trust me to go out on my own and follow the general outline that we had used in the study of the evacuation. So I went to Manzanar and got along very well, enjoyed myself, and I enjoyed working with the American Japanese, and I visited around, made my notes and my report. They asked me if I'd come back to see them again, and the director of the camp also said, "What are you? Are you a sociologist, a social worker, a teacher?" I think those questions have puzzled me all my life. So anyway, I said, "Well, what do you want?" And by that time, my husband was going in service pretty soon, so my little girl, who was 4 years old, and my aunt and I were very free to move any place, and I didn't want to get into the war effort. So that was one reason I came to Manzanar. I had collected credentials along the way. I think I must have had 6 or 7 education credentials, including superintendent of education. And at that time, that was I was getting a doctor's degree fairly young, and women did not pick them up so easily in those days.
And that was in social work?
No, there was a school at Berkeley. I had taken several social work classes. I'll digress to tell this part.
Yes.
Because it tells you something about the stage of social work. At that time, there were a few classes under the Department of Economics at Berkeley. One of them I remember so well. It was called psychiatric social work. At one end of the table sat the psychiatrist. At the other end of the table sat the social worker. They would take turns of about 15 minutes apiece and give a short lecture. And after about 4 of these, the class period was over, and we would nod from one part of the table to the other, psychiatry and social work as it was taught at that time. But the integration of the psychiatric and the social work was left to the students. We just hadn't progressed that far in social work. And then there were 2 or 3 other classes that I took at that time. But that was my first classroom contact with social work, except in New Mexico, where I had come before I went to Berkeley to school with my husband. There were 2 professional social workers in Santa Fe, the only in the state. They were very good people.
Yes.
One was the dean of the School of Social Work in New Orleans, and the other was a very fine child welfare expert. So they offered a few classes after work, and I took those. But it was a patch's patch can in those days. It was quite a while before Berkeley got a School of Social Work organized.
Yes.
Now where were we?
Yes, I had experience at Berkeley at the same time. I used to go over and lecture, and it always had to be in their criminology department.
Yes, bootlegged here and bootlegged
Bootlegged
there.
here and there, right. Yes. I wondered, could you describe the administration of the camp?
Yes, most of the staff came from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, civil service. It was a matter of moving over people who were experienced. Now the whole camp was laid out with a sort of philosophy of not socialism, but we had a co-op, and there was provided to have a block manager from each block who would meet together as a council. The police force had an outside trained police chief, but the staff was made up of people from around the camp who had perhaps some background in law or police work, and then they were trained. The schools were set up on what was called a community-based philosophy, school-centered community, so that there was a plan for the total community. There were about, I'd say, 9 or 10 people you'd call chief staff. I was the only woman. It was always interesting whenever we had congressional committees or so on, and I'll speak to that later, that I was the only woman, and I found out quite a while that I shouldn't sit on a footstool. You're low enough in esteem. Always get a good high chair when you're in a meeting with government officials and you're the only woman.
That's good advice. Did you live in the camp?
Yes.
Itself?
The Army built the camp in typical Army style. They were all regulation Army barracks with black tar paper. Now, each barrack, I have forgotten how many, would have about 7 to 9 beams. So you would then say the Matsumoto family with 9 or 10 would have so many beams for the number of people they had in the family. Now, it so happened that sometimes they would be assigned a floor space in the barrack, but the family grew larger as they got more fearful, and were so afraid of being divided that they bring in maybe a couple of cousins or so that they hadn't in the beginning. So some of them were, we say, overcrowded. At the beginning, there were no petitions. You hung up a quilt or a blanket, or it was very primitive. It was the Army cots were there. There were carton boxes and cartons, and no locks at the beginning, so that it was. And of course, they had everybody had the coal oil stove. The Caucasian barracks did have a coating of white boards on the outside. And we did have a tiny little kitchen with a kind of an oil stove, and you had an oil heater. And it had one bedroom that was so small you could hardly get a big bed in there. So that it was, it had the convolium on the floor. It was very much like the American-Japanese side. But there was some people think there's a division or a borderline where you can't cross over, and so there wasn't anything like that. It was all together, except that the Caucasian buildings were at one end, and around the total Manzanar area was the barbed wire was in front. I don't recall other wires except as markers, but there were towers at the corners. And we see so many pictures of the towers and the Army base. I don't know, we were always told that they were 4Fs. I don't know if that was a derogatory title or not. But they weren't such snappy soldiers as we found out later whenever they came over for the riot with their pants half on and so on. It was an easy life, and they had their barracks, just like the Japanese, and mess hall. So that on the whole, it was an Army design. The Children's Village we'll come to later. It was nothing built for children. And then the hospital was supposed to plan for what we call to have a delivery room, and their delivery room was a big platform covered for the trucks to drive up and deliver. So that, all in all, the RV design was not very suitable, but in wartime, I suppose it worked out about as well as it could be expected with the scarcity of material and all.
Yes. And the food was served in mess hall to the Japanese, and was it Japanese food?
Well, yes, there was no question about food, although there would be rumors from time to time that food was running scarce, and they'd carry rice put under the bed, but that was just at a beginning period when life was very uncertain there. Each kitchen had its own chefs and helpers, and the foods were distributed to the various kitchens, so that actually for the first time a lot of the women who had worked in the field so hard didn't even have meals to prepare, and that was the time when all the family and the people got together. On the side, they had quite good control, and on the distribution of the food there was certainly plenty of it. One interesting angle has to do with the bootlegging and making of sake. There were about 3 or 4 kitchens had a dugout underneath the kitchen, and that was partly part of the trouble. They took more than their share of sugar, of course, but everybody knew where they were, and the Caucasian staff knew, and the sake always found its way to the parties and the weddings and so on, which I'll mention later. But that was part of the. Some of them were disgruntled, and then that was fearful. If a mess hall got short of sugar, even though everyone knew where it was going, you just didn't talk about it, and staff didn't talk about it either. If they wanted to, that was their problem.
Socially approved bootlegging.
It was, you just more or less didn't see it.
Yes, overlooked. Very good. What was the organization among the Japanese themselves?
I mean, like a social organization?
Social organization, did they?
Well, it's interesting how with everybody leveled off to the same level. $16 a month allowance for ordinary work, $18 a month if you're a lawyer or professional person, a teacher, nurse, or something like that, doctor, so that everybody has a $16 a month. The pea jackets were very, very warm and up to the head and neck, and were issued, and everybody wore those navy blue pea jackets. So that makes everyone even look alike. But very soon, social class could be distinguished as rising up from those tar-papered barracks that all looked alike, and there were the economic range was from millionaires to fishermen in San Pedro, so that you wouldn't think it would happen so quickly there, especially when they all had equal suffering and deprivation. But before long, in the high schools, you had sororities. I remember some of them were called like the Golden Dukes, or and the girls had something with a gardenia name, and how they managed. But the Japanese are very good in artificial flowers, flower making. And the young man would send an orchid or a gardenia to his girl for the dance, and it would look just for real. And they had music, and it was they dressed up, and it was and the fraternities and sororities themselves had rank. They all knew which was the best and which was next. I suppose maybe the one that was at the end of the totem pole would be the sort of a rough group of San Pedro young youth, about 17 to about 21. And they aggravated the rest of the population, particularly the teenagers and the early young adults, by going barefooted and using naughty words and so on. But they built a very rough basketball team, and they won every game through their athletics. But that was looked down upon as they aren't polite, they're rough and uncouth. but there's certainly a hierarchy in a short time.
In a very short time. It's fascinating, it really is. And did they have elected officers or any formalized type of organization?
With the total population?
Yes.
They had, for example, the block managers. I'll mention that later. I think that's a topic coming up pretty soon in our discussion because it changed hands. We had a PTA organization, and I must say that's a little black mark against California. I tried very hard to get our PTA chapter that we had organized into the Los Angeles PTA, because that's
Yes.
where by far the most of them lived, in Los Angeles.
Yes.
But they didn't want to get mixed up with enemy aliens, and they turned us down. It was a very abrupt turn down. But the state allowed a PTA chapter to be issued from the state level. And we have an excellent PTA. And for graduation and all, the officers of the PTA would also get academic gowns. Our high school graduations were very serious affairs. And everybody who was up at the top with education and all had in sponsoring events or in the PTA wore the academic gown following the high school students. And each senior graduate certainly had the best gown available, was shipped in from Los Angeles for graduation. So that then I suppose the bureaucracy was very similar because many of our procedures in purchasing and financing and all and employment were regulation government.
Yes. Yes.
So that it operated within a sort of mixture of participation and government bureaucracy.
There were reports, I remember, of riots in the Manzanar camp. I wonder if you can recall causes of these, the results.
There was just one, actually. I mentioned the block managers. At the beginning, whenever the administration, and you have to get going fast, you just can't wait for all these things to happen. You can't even wait until you are familiar with your situation. So that the ones that came forward, more or less volunteering to be a block manager, were those who were, those Nisei, who were 21, 22, 23 in there, and whose English was good, and they could communicate quickly with the staff. And the Caucasian staff by this time had not had any Japanese, so that they weren't able to communicate or to give out warnings or signals and so forth to pressure build up in the camp because of the it was the wrong leadership, and so that that was one cause, that they were not getting the warning signals of rumors and of fearfulness, and of the FBI also picking up people. There were informers, and it was growing rugged. The precipitating event was when I think it was something part of the Department of Justice moved in and picked up 6 men for causing trouble. I think a couple of them were Kibei, for those who were educated in Japan,
Yes.
and who were very much like sore thumbs all the way through. They didn't belong. The Nisei didn't care about them. They weren't, except of course in the family, but they weren't like other teenagers or young adults, and they were bitter and they were dissatisfied. So that when all of these things came together, and there was the arrest. A mob gathered around. It wasn't a mob at first. It was a march. The administration building and demanded the release of the 5 or 6 men who were in the jail at Independence. The director, Mr. Barrett, came out and talked to them, and so did the assistant director. And pretty soon it got rough. They were pushing each other. Someone started to throw something, and it got out of hand. Now, the policy was that if at any time the project director failed to keep control and keep order, if it seemed to be getting out of hand, he was to give up his post and to call in the army next door. Captain Hall was his name, I think. So that we were all out of a job that day, and everybody had to quit. The director had to quit, and the Army moved in. I'll just say one more comment on the Army. After things had quieted down a little bit, their next move was to hunt for contraband. And it was so amusing. They brought in scissors and knives and razors and made such a big effort. Of course, they didn't find anything, but in their contraband drive. But it was a serious affair. There were 4 or 5 shot in the back. One was killed, and I never did get an exact picture of how serious the others were in the shooting. But the Army that moved in, they were very disarrayed. They were not disciplined. Somebody said, well, let's put it this way. One soldier got out of line, and he became frightened when someone pushed a car down the hill toward where the Army was stationed there, and he fired. Well, as soon as he fired, now this hasn't been reported, but I certainly saw it with my own eyes, then the captain said fire. And they fired. And by that time, the tear gas was pretty heavy, and everybody was running. I was running too. But one of my purposes in running was because my little girl was about 4 years old then. And the gas was so bad, maybe she might be in danger. So I dashed over to my barrack and found out that it was pretty well centered just in around 1 block and hadn't hit the residences very much. But it was bad. So that the next morning, every Japanese in the camp had a black band on the arm. And I never did find out, and I've often wondered, where did they get that black material? Enough material as black to dress everybody in a black armband by the next morning. And there was silent treatment. Now that's as near as we ever came to feeling a racial division. That was when nobody would speak to you. And your secretary would sort of run around the building so that she wasn't embarrassed to speak to you, and then so that her friends and others around her building would know that they all had agreed not to speak. So the silence ended in a few days. Meanwhile, the teachers, the workers, that is the Caucasian staff, all volunteered for the jobs. All work stopped, so that somebody had to pick up the oil trucks, the garbage, certain sanitary inspections and all, to see that groceries came in, food and all, to make sure that the children there who were in the separate buildings were cared for, so that we had other kinds of work until such time as the Army went back home next door.
I see. And the morale must have been very low for quite a period of time within the camp.
See, it was close to Christmas. The riot was around the 7th of December. But it was a coincidence, actually. It wasn't just because Pearl Harbor was December the 7th. But it was a coincidence. And it was on Christmas Eve. It was a very emotional thing when particularly the Christian group, the Japanese young people, walked over to the Caucasian buildings there and sang Christmas carols, Holy Night, and all of those beautiful carols. And then we picked up the clue and grabbed our kids and joined the line, and then we all marched over to the Japanese buildings. And then everybody sang, and then they came out of the buildings and sang. It was a spontaneous kind of a group movement that was so stirring. And then, I won't say just that one event, everybody was about ready. that right away it was quiet, and we went back to our respective jobs, and all of our friends and our staff and all wanted us to be sure and understand that they thought about us all the time, and they knew that we didn't mean any harm or anything.
Yes.
So it was a quick healing session.
Well, it took Christmas season to do it.
Well, I think Christmas added to it.
That's-
We were all ready.
That's very interesting. I wonder about the medical programs within the camps, whether you used the Japanese doctors or whether they used the Army doctors, or what arrangements.
For quite a while, the hospital was run by the Japanese people with a medical background. There were at least 3 physicians, one a very excellent surgeon from County Hospital, who ran the hospital. There was one who had been with the surgical company and so on, and he was the hospital administrator. There were a number of Japanese nurses. Apparently that the women who were trained as nurses had much better possibilities for jobs than those who were school teachers trained who couldn't get jobs in Los Angeles. But the civil service doctor didn't come in for some time later. And in my opinion, he was not the quality of the Japanese doctors, but they were on civil service and were available and were sent there. They didn't stay too long, but the hospital was always run well. It was directly for the Japanese population. The Caucasians had to just get what you could get. They also had dentistry. It was awfully hard to get out to have your teeth. I had cared for, and I was having trouble with my gums, and I just could not. The way to drive in or go up to Bishop, and the Dr. Kikuchi, one of the dentists, bootlegged me in at night. and I thought, oh, I hope not too many other Caucasians find out that he's going. But if I had, he saved my teeth. It was a difficult time. But for any other, if it were a death threat, you could you could go to the hospital. But otherwise, you find your way to Lone Pine or Bishop or someplace. So that in some ways, it wasn't the Caucasians had hardships with the severe weather and storms. The buildings were certainly very poor shelter at times, and with the shortage of medical care and dentistry, it wasn't so easy either for the Caucasian staff.
Yes. Can you name some of the Caucasian staff who were there at the time? You recall?
Well, I just think of, I can't perhaps think of their names, but for, Mr. Nielsen, who was the recreation man, and then there was the top positions were like director of agriculture, that was Sandridge, of maintenance and building, I've forgotten his name now, but they were people, probably, I think they were from civil service, engineers, they were very well qualified, and the fiscal and finance man. I think you'd find it just the average run if you had we'll say, a large Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters.
Were any of them social workers?
No, there was no professional social workers. Later, if you a little bit, do we have down there something about social workers?
Dr. Deal?
Oh, yes. Let me tell about Margaret Deal. Margaret, before I come to Margaret, let me say that there was a place on the personnel, besides all the teachers, which were about 100. I can come back to that, teachers and principals and so on. There was the place for a social worker. We didn't think so much about a social worker at the beginning because you were sort of on a survival, fast beat trying to get food, clothing, and shelter going. But as the families moved in to the barracks, without proper partitions at times. And the fearfulness and the uneasiness about not knowing what was going to happen to them, and particularly their fear of getting their families broken up or separated, created quite a bit of problems. At first, it was my job then to get a counselor for each block. For the personnel department, I selected those who had had something in the social sciences, sociology, psychology, or something along that line, and they all turned out to be 20, 21, 22, 23 years old. So we put them on as a block counselor, and they would come back almost in tears, and so would I be. Nobody would counsel with them. And they knew some of the problems that were going on. So that we said, well, something is wrong here. We'll have to see. They're getting advice. They're talking to somebody. Somebody's giving them guidance. So we discussed this, and then they knew that they weren't what you call the wise ones. So all the social workers were fired, the ones we call social workers, and we made this inquiry into each block. Who's the wise one in your block, a man or a woman? Who hears the troubles, and who helps families settle their squabbles and so forth? And when there's a boy-girl kind of problem, who advises the parents? So they nominated, and we had a staff of the wise ones, one from each block. And there was, they were utilized, and they did a very good job. Very soon it was obvious we had to have a director of social work. So that I looked through all the civil service files that were had available applicants, and found this one in Portersville in Southern California, 67 plus years of age. They said, well, you can't recruit the civil service somebody who's already 67, 68. And said they want you out when you're 65 at that time. So I said, well, let me just try first. So I went to see her, and I was so pleased. She was the director of the YWCA in Tokyo for 15 years, and her language, she speaks excellent Japanese, fluent Japanese. So, and she had this dignity and gray hair, and a very understanding kind of person, and a soft voice, spoke slowly, clearly. So I employed her, and it was a job to get her through, but she was approved. And she was to come back very shortly. We rushed this through because we really did need someone to tie all these pieces together. So we had a welcome for her. And in Manzanar style, you must always have the public address system if it's of any importance at all. That gives it status. And then if it were a meeting of a great announcement, you put two trucks together, and you had the floodlights on the trucks, and then all the Japanese sat on their pillows, on the sand, in the fire break, and faced the back ends of the truck, you see. So we had the meeting, and by this time, I had been studying my Japanese, so I think we went after work each day. And our teachers were the Navy teachers from Boulder. And they were very tough on us. They just enjoyed putting these officials through a hard time. But it was conversational Japanese. So I could speak about 5 or 6, 7 minutes. And I did my speech, and I introduced Margaret Deal as the director of social work, and someone that they would all love because she spoke their language so fluently, and she knew the people so well. And then it occurred to me, I had never heard her speak. How did I know she could speak a word of Japanese? So I began to turn a little bit pale. I introduced her, and then she stood up and faced this whole sea of brown faces out there, all looking with great anticipation, and nothing came out. And then she moved a couple of more steps toward them, and still she didn't speak. I said, I wonder if there's a mistake or something. So then finally she looked at them, and this whole group of faces looking up at her. They were on the ground, and she was standing on the truck, back end of the truck. And then she began to speak. It was the most beautiful music and sound I ever heard. And slowly at first, and then it became louder, and then she moved closer to them, and then she spoke more distinctly over the microphone, and they just loved it. And she was very good for them, and did a beautiful job. But also it does show that a community can use some kind of social work at one time, and then at another it isn't appropriate. It doesn't do the job for them. We began the relocation program, where it was so many balls had to be kept in the air at one time. With a family group, younger children had to be placed in school. There had to be employment verified. There had to be funds allowed. There had to be sponsors. There was a large file that had to be built up before it could get through for approval for relocation, and it had to be done fast. And somebody who could pick up the phone and call through maybe 5 or 6 agencies in a community and get it done in a hurry. So brought in a very vigorous social worker from New York. She carried on with most of the social work from then on. And then Margaret began to withdraw somewhat, because by that time too, the families were pretty well settled. But just one side comment with Margaret Deal. She was a very wonderful person. We began to give her some assignments of visitors. And I must say, when we had visitors there, and all the Japanese people knew this too, if we had Happy Chandler come with a very nasty committee from Congress and something to investigate, to see if they were suffering. So we'd tell the block leaders or whatever, said, who's coming in for the next visit? And they said, oh, well, let's see. Why don't you show them the Watanabe? They just got 6 beams and they got 15 people jammed in there. And they would help make up the list, and we'd take the committees and run. Then we'd have the missionaries and the preachers, and everybody come in and wanted to know if we were treating the people properly and if we were giving them love and all of that. So we have between the love and the suffering group, you see, towards A, towards B, and kind of sometimes towards C. It had a little of both. So that Margaret Deal began to handle some of those when her workload went down. And there was a Methodist minister who had just finished his doctor's degree. And he kept coming in each time, and she'd show him around again. Anyway, the story concludes that he asked her to marry him, and they had the December-type marriage, not in camp, but we gave him a real good party, and she lived for 4 years afterwards. She finally died before he did, but it's a happy ending to the elderly social worker who was so gracious to the people and also a gracious person. So that's a conclusion of my social work story.
That's an interesting story, very.
This ends side 1 or side A of the tape. Please allow the tape to run to its end and then turn over to the second part of Dr. Carter's interview. Music. Dr. Carter, could you discuss some of the personal relationships that existed between the Caucasian staff members and the Japanese interns?
All right, I'll just make a few comments. That's a common question that people ask because there's some kind of confusion as to the nature of the relocation camp and the position of staff, which was all Caucasian at that time, and their relationships with each other, and were there racial tensions and so on. I would say, I think it was, on the whole, very good relationships. There were some who never came forward at all, and you didn't see much of them. But the relationships were very strong between, take the construction company, Mr. Sandridge and his staff. Their friendships and letters went on for years afterwards. In the education and the community staff, where I headed up a division, for many years we had not only letters like 15, 20, 30 very often, and reunions where almost every graduating class would have a reunion. And in Little Tokyo or somewhere, there were Christmas presents, Christmas cards. I think long-lasting friendships that lasted 15, some of them now is 44 and 45 years, and they're still friendships. So that, and people got to know each other. When I was before I went into camp, I think the only Japanese Americans I knew were on campus or students. And in this way, we learned a lot about each other, and I think it was quite wholesome, and went along much better than most everybody would at first think about it. There was certainly a difference. You can't, between the staff and the community, and you can't get around that. That was reality. But the community around Manzanar didn't necessarily see us in that perspective. I was called, a Jap lover, and by a lot of relatives and my own family. So people couldn't understand why I would want to do my war effort in a camp with American Japanese. The people around in Manzanar and Inyo and Ono counties were very, very upset at having the Manzanar camp moved into their geography. Why us? Why don't you move it someplace else? They were very hostile. Even when I went in Sunday with the church, taking my little girl with me, going in there and very brave-like, and still being whispered around and pointed to as what that Jap lover from that camp that's close by. So that we took a lot of beating with it. One time earlier, whenever it was possible for the internees, the residents rather, to go out in the community, we arranged for a picnic. This was a group of teachers, grade school and high school teachers, and we had some watermelons from the gardens. Oh, we had beautiful fruit and vegetables, and chickens and so on that the Department of Agriculture, the Division of Agriculture, the camp grew. So, and always carrots and different kinds of French things. So we had a big picnic, and a driver for the truck, and went out to a place close by where they had a brook. And we put the watermelons in the brook, and we had the soft drinks. We put them in the water to cool them, and then we had guitars and music instruments, and singing Japanese, and singing the old school type songs. And we just got settled and having a good time. And this farmer came around from a bunch of trees there, right by us on the brook with a big shotgun. Now, if anybody knows the history of Inyo and Mono counties and the war going on there for years with the water rights, those farmers with shotguns aren't just playing games. They shoot. So that I knew my history there. And he came up and he pointed this gun at us, and he says, "You Japs get off of my territory, you get out of here in a hurry, or I'm going to shoot, and I'm going to first shoot that goddamn Jap lover." Well, that was me. And I said, yeah. I was the head person of the group, the responsible ranking person. So I had to walk up to him, and I didn't. I just did what I thought intuitively it might work. So I didn't know it was called diversion, but that's what I did. I said, "But you see our watermelons out there, our 2 watermelons. If we could just get those watermelons back, you see how they're getting cold now, and those cokes. Can we get them out?" And he said, all right, get them out, but get out here in a hurry. So we rushed out there and got the watermelons and the Cokes and scrambled into the truck and hiked it back as fast as we could to Manzanar gates and got inside, and it was a good feeling to get inside that barbed wire.
I would think
with
so.
a guy out there with a shotgun. That was common up and down. There were hazards for people associated with the camp because they had distorted ideas. And sometimes people outside now have distorted ideas as just to what went on inside of the relocation center. So that's my story on
Well, that's great adventure.
the local people.
I'll say. I wondered, would you tell me a little about the children's programs that you had?
Oh, yes. Well, that was a pleasure to at least develop. Manzanar was selected as the relocation center to receive the children from 3 orphanages. The Episcopal Orphanage, out close to Pasadena, you know where that is.
Yes.
A man and his wife, a young couple. She was a trained social worker, professional social worker. He was the businessman for the orphanage. Then we had the Salvation Army, and we had the Roman Catholic. What is the name of that? It's evangelical Catholic order. Well, it'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, the 3 orphanages, and I received a telegram one afternoon that in 48 hours, the 3 orphanages would be coming in 3 buses to Manzanar with infants and preschool toddlers who were 1/4 Japanese blood and who were in the orphanages. So we have the older children holding the little ones, and the staff that came with them with the little enemy aliens in their arms, and they're hot and tired after that afternoon ride, and coming to this strange place. I wonder what kind of orientation those children received before they packed them up with their belongings and got into these buses and they went over that dry desert territory to get into Manzanar. Well, we had prepared as well as we could. The Army had no idea about children, so there wasn't anything for children to take a bath in, except for the homemakers who were coming in and to agree that they would get in the shower and hold the children while they were getting their baths. And then we had to make quite a number of changes in order to have some groups of children instead of a whole long army barrack of adult men sleeping there, so that it took quite a bit of adjustment. But the people who worked in the orphanage really did enjoy their work and enjoyed the children. Now there was one of, I think, the most critical decisions I ever made in my life. I had about 12 hours or so to decide who was going to be the administrator, because each orphanage had come with staff. There were 3 or 4 staff members from each orphanage, and they were prepared to stay. Well, you just couldn't have a mixture of staff like that, because they have different philosophies and different ways of programming, so that I had to make a decision as to who would go back and who would stay to manage the orphanage. So I decided that I would select the Episcopalian couple because of their language. Now the 2 nuns with the Catholic order and the priest also spoke Japanese, but their English was very poor, so that for communication for everybody, the best deal was to have the couple who could speak both Japanese and English, and we'd get going sooner and faster, and get the program started, and all these youngsters settled down. There was one young man who was 16, who had about 15 or 16. And he came in with the children, but he really had been with a foster family of Anglos, and he had never been around Japanese children before. He couldn't speak Japanese. And I could see him standing out in the middle of that of the camp at a fire break. He looked out there and he said, "My God, I've never seen so many Japs in all my life." He had never, just closing in a whole group of people that he had never had a chance to talk with or play with, and how strange it must be just because he was American Japanese who had never had Japanese blood, but he had never lived or been around them. And then there was one Spanish kid, I've forgotten his name now, but he had always lived with this Japanese family. He didn't have any family of his own, and he had an awful time getting in because he couldn't show that he was part Japanese blood. But they already didn't know what to do with him because he was there, and he had no family to go to, and they had no one to make any other arrangements. So they finally decided that he could come in, but it just worried them no end how to fix his file up and what to do with him. But he was very happy. He was living with his family, his Japanese family, and his Japanese brothers and sisters, and he stayed on for about 2 years before there was some plan worked out where he went back. He went back to Los Angeles, where he was. So that you have all these kinds of mixtures and confrontations that are interesting, and you look back over it, and you just wonder how how viable and flexible people must be in order to adjust and adapt to all of these strange happenings based on something like how much of Japanese blood do you have?
It's amazing. Amazing. Was there any rationale at all given for bringing children in who say were only a quarter Japanese?
Well, the general order of the Army's order was no matter if you were an infant or a child or old man 90, you had Japanese blood. That was the only differentiating factor.
That made you dangerous at the time.
Yes, that was the easiest and most simple way of moving fast to segregate this population.
It's such a marvelous example of the hysteria of the war period.
I've often said that if you were economy-minded, cost containment-minded, you would have had employed an individual FBI agent for each family, and it would have cost a lot less.
Of course. In retrospect, we know those things.
I have one other. I didn't mention the library, did I?
No, you hadn't.
As the Japanese moved in, they collected their books. And they didn't have room for them. So we collected books too from Caucasian staff, and we started a library. And it was a very busy library because we had almost had books printed in Japanese could then exchange, and because there was no other resources, and this was a great help for them. We had motion pictures, and we had other kinds of entertainment. But the library was quite an important institution, and that took up a whole barrack, and so that. And we had, of course, the librarians with experience from the camp there. One morning I got a telegram saying that an investigation committee from Washington was coming in to inspect our library to see what kind of espionage we had going on in the library.
Could they read Japanese?
Well, yes, they had
Interpreter.
they had a staff coming in who could read Japanese. They wanted to look over the titles and content and see what we had in the library. So I really wasn't sure. We had an adult education department, and we had 2 or 3 leaders among that adult education department because we had English classes, and then we had other kinds of discussion groups and all that they organized themselves as volunteers. So I called on them, and we were open all night in going through every book to make sure that everything had been reviewed before that committee came the next day. And I think I believe we did find 4 or 5 books that could be suspicious of some kind of propaganda or something. So we took them and we take them out and burn them, and then bury the ashes. Then the next day our committee came, and it was such a tiny little speck of questionable books. And when I understood what was in the contents, I didn't think there was much to it, but we didn't want to take any chances of being in an unfavorable position. So we took care of it. The next day we had the visiting committee, and they were quite pleased. And we also get questions about, well, did you try to submerge or discourage Japanese cultural type of activities? I know they were certainly encouraged. The judo hall was a magnificent building. Whatever the main comparison is, an army barrack. And they built it themselves, and they paid for the lumber, but we had to help them arrange to have it delivered and all. And they carried on the classes most every day in judo and the old cultural type of, I guess you'd call them, martial arts. So, and then we had many programs of the old classics, which takes so long. It takes about 3 hours for one story to take place, and unless you know the language, you really can't appreciate it so much. We had Japanese music you'd hear up and down any road between the blocks, and there were certain popular pieces that they played over and over again. Wherever I'd hear them, I'd know them any place. And then, of course, the teenagers and the younger adults had all the records of the same popular songs, and at their dances and all, or their gathering, in the church gatherings. There was in the Roman Catholic Church and the Buddhist Church and the Episcopal Church. The young folks always had their Epworth League and their readings, and they'd have their records and their dances. And they also they were in a fortunate position of having a very creative and gifted music supervisor in the high school who wrote plays. He was in the movies himself for a while, and was just the kind of a guy that the young Nisei adored. And they had a ceremony for him at his death later on, and they really, he was pointed to many times as being the one who had done so much in developing their lives, because they were then the lead and the male lead and female lead in the plays and the operettas and the choruses. Everybody participated, and some of the young folks said we could never have had the lead in the senior play back in Los Angeles, or we could never have done this in Los Angeles. And here, we make our own music. And I remember one song. It was a very beautiful girl with a deep contralto voice, and they called her the Songbird of Manzanar. And he wrote a song for her to sing, and it was a very plaintive song. I've forgotten the words, but it had to do with a boy and a girl in Manzanar, and they were having their romance, and they could never find a private place to hold hands, or to arms, or to be alone together. Marvelous. And to talk over their plans for the future when they got out of Manzanar, what they would do when they would get married and all. And then the song sort of ends that it'll soon be over, and then we'll meet again where we can have our privacy and our love.
Isn't that marvelous? Oh, if we could only have a recording of that now, it'd be a great thing.
It's a beautiful song.
Oh, yes. Dr. Carter, we've covered a great deal of material over the last hour or so, and I wonder if there's some additional things that you think of that you might like to talk about.
One area that we haven't talked about, and for a good reason, I suppose, are the emotions and the feelings of both staff and the American Japanese population. That's seldom ever talked about. People think of, physical deprivation, and there was some, but the Caucasian staff had deprivation. In fact, everybody during the war was doing without something, or working hard, or having some kind of hardships. But it seems, if I look back now, one of the important events that seldom get mentioned, but that I think it comes out once in a while, and that is the recruitment of volunteers for the United States Army. I believe it was called the 442nd. And the volunteers were called for at Manzanar. And at the same time, the recruiting was in the adjacent counties. And the response of volunteers to the youth population was much greater inside the barbed wire than it was outside the barbed wire. These youngsters just wanted to prove that they were loyal Americans and that they were good soldiers. And some of the expressions from the Japanese American soldiers were like, "Go for broke," and "Don't stick your neck out." And I can still remember a good number of them that came from that group. They were very proud, and the barracks would have the pictures of the son of the brother who was at war in Italy most of the time. And this always reminds me of the visit we had from Happy Chandler, maybe a decade or so back. Some of you can remember he was a very outgoing politician, connected with baseball too in some way, I believe, from Kentucky. He brought his wife out on this visit with several members of the committee to inspect the camp and to see if they were being coddled. And as I mentioned before, you have some groups that are concerned that the Japanese Americans were being unjustly, not unjustly, that's a poor word, unfairly treated, and others that they were being coddled. So that whenever Mrs. Chandler came with Happy Chandler, since I was the only woman in top staff, this is to be expected. I was assigned to Mrs. Chandler to escort her around all day long. She had on high heels in that sandy, gravelly soil, where you do well if you wear rubber boots part of the time to keep your feet on the ground. So that then we had planned a sort of cocktail party and dinner that night for a little a social interlude after they had covered their rounds in the day. So that I had Mrs. Chandler all day long, and she was really mortally afraid of being stabbed in the back or being in some way hurt or damaged. I think she thought maybe the two of us should have had an escort or a soldier with us. As we went around the camp, I showed her the nursery school and the beauty parlor and the co-op and several things I thought she might be interested in. On all day long, I asked her if she didn't want to, come to my place, my barrack, and wash up, have a little interlude there. No, as to my day, I don't see how she made it all day long. She was fearful of going into any bathroom, any place in the whole camp. So she just stayed out there until someone stayed with her. I do remember once in a while. But her one remark has always stuck with me. I was trying to find things I thought she'd be interested in. So I told her about the draft and how the American Japanese had volunteered and how the high percentage went from inside the camp more than the response on the outside around us. And then I said, she didn't say much. I said, "Well, don't you think that's rather surprising, a good thing?" And she said, "Yes, this is Yeah, it is a good thing. So as you know what we could do with that. See, you could put the Japanese American boys up front, then that would protect our boys.
Isn't
That's
that
about-
oh, what an attitude.
Now we get into some of the other points about just what was the loss. Of course, the financial loss was great for the American Japanese. But more important than that, I think, and we all had some losses, but privacy and, of course, the loss of freedom and the loss of personal control because you are bound in and can't pursue your life and develop it as you want to. But the war disrupted a lot of people, I suppose, and everyone sort of stopped still for a while until after the war, so that we just don't know the cost in terms of social costs. We know them in terms of financial cost. And there's no place where we read now that wouldn't say it was a very unjust kind of move. But what the other alternatives were, we don't hear much about suggestions like that. So that maybe something else could have been done to ease all attention at that time. But I've often thought that if we had the FBI agent for each family, it would have been at least something to consider, and certainly would have been much less expensive for the country. But I haven't heard many others point to other alternatives, except they do point to Hawaii and that huge population. But they had no other choice but to do the thing they did do, which was right, and worked out all right. I don't know what else we could have done here. In the East and Middle West, it worked out just fine. Japanese Americans were still in place, carrying on their work, maybe uneasy, but they were carrying it on, so that their lives were not disrupted. In California particularly, there were other political and economic forces that were influencing the removal of the Japanese. We haven't had that written down very clearly, but the property and particularly the truck gardening industry and the greenhouse, some of the industries that were in the farming getting very competitive, and there were others in the same business and the same work who felt that competition, and that perhaps intensified their hostility toward the American Japanese. I won't try to answer those important questions like that. Let someone else who looks back in history years later try to tell us just why did it happen, and why did it happen the way it did, and was it in the long run a way of integrating and spurring on and enhancing the Japanese role in this country in economy and education and science and all of the good things of life that we all strive for, because you can hardly see the scars now. The Japanese people have done so well, and they have such a set of values that have been their influencing source. And I often quote a principle or a rule that I've heard many times about education, because in camp, although it was rough and they had good teachers, they did well, they made their relocation, and none of the Japanese students ever went back a grade. They were all such good students and worked so hard and so well that I think the value system has continued to guide them. And the principle goes like this: children, never walk on the shadow of the teacher.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Carter. We appreciate so much your willingness to do this interview.